Star Wars used to represent all that was great about science fiction cinema: swashbuckling swagger, great love and companionship, and a wild innocence that never cared about the odds, only that there was hope. Equally impressive was the immediate emblazoning of Star Wars on the American cultural psyche. Almost overnight, Star Wars became an essential piece of American lore, beloved by generation after generation of viewers. It even created new sayings with a rare power like,
"Use the Force, Luke,"
and "May the Force be with you." Today, the only thing that Star Wars seems to create is a sense of dread. So what happened? After the sequel trilogy, there can be no doubt that Disney Lucasfilm was in a panic. And just as it looked like Star Wars would die, the prayers of Kathleen Kennedy were answered. The Mandalorian premiered to the best audience reception in a very, very long time. Not only did Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau serve fans a comfortable, digestible, and generally unique show in the first season of The Mandalorian, but they gifted Kathleen Kennedy with one of the greatest merch plays of all time, Baby Yoda. So is Star Wars back on track? Had the sequel mishap simply been an isolated hiccup as the new team at Disney Lucasfilm found its footing? No. It got worse. It got so much worse. Let's start with one of the most serious issues of all, which has been made the most trivial issue of all: immortality. It used to be something reserved for a truly legendary user of the Force. Think Yoda, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Anakin. Now everyone survives everything, and if one version of you doesn't, you've got some clones as a backup. One problem with the Boba Fett show was that they already had a bounty hunter show in The Mandalorian. But the bigger problem is that Boba Fett is supposed to be dead. Reva was stabbed with a lightsaber right through the chest when she was a child, but somehow she survived. When she faced off with Vader a second time, one of the greatest lightsaber duelists to have ever lived, he skewers her, but somehow she survived. The Grand Inquisitor was stabbed by Reva, again right through the chest, but somehow he survived. And of course, Palpatine was supposed to be dead, but somehow he returned. IG-11 blew himself up in noble self-sacrifice, but he's put back together. Moff Gideon was supposed to be sent away and never heard from again, but he's right back in the series and he's escaped certain justice. So if death is trivial and none of these characters can ever really be removed from the story, the stakes for all these films and TV shows immediately becomes next to nothing, which means the emotional involvement of the audience becomes next to nothing. Sometimes, nothing is a good thing. For example, you might not want to live in a very dangerous world, unless of course you are telling a story. Then you want a very, very dangerous world. Let's face it, the galaxy hasn't been in danger for a very long time. Sure, part of that's because no one dies anymore, but there hasn't been a real menace, only phantoms lurking among the stars for a while now. Moff Gideon is incredibly instructive here. Gideon could have been an interesting villain, almost James Bondian in nature. Once we learned what his actual plans were, it all does sound a bit diabolical. Take the best part of every group in the galaxy and put them in one body, including the Force. I can see you've just facepalmed yourself, since the Force can just be given to anyone now with, science. Thankfully, that never transpires. And since Gideon never gets the Force ability, he's simply a guy wearing a mech suit going up against an incredible bounty hunter and a powerful Force user. He's not threatening even in the slightest. But Moff Gideon is a rare exception for villains in these shows because many times the show can't even figure out who the villain actually is. The Book of Boba Fett especially suffers from this. While we're shown a series of low-level bad guys doing bad stuff in and around town, there's no central villain for the audience to identify and really set up as the main threat to Boba Fett and his ambitions. Even when they introduce the Hutt twins, they don't seem that intimidating. Just because you're related to Jabba the Hutt doesn't mean I assume that you're a pair of terrifying galactic crime lords. The Wookiee mercenary they bring doesn't really seem scary either. How could he? We haven't even seen what he's done to know what he's capable of, and Boba Fett doesn't care about him, nor do any of Boba Fett's friendly thugs. The same is true for Cad Bane. In Obi-Wan Kenobi, there is a clumsy balancing act between Reva, the Grand Inquisitor, the other Inquisitor, and Vader. That's a lot of scum and villainy, and the Inquisitors largely felt like a smartly conceived but terribly executed distraction at best, an empty filler designed to push the inevitable showdown between Vader and Obi-Wan off until the final episode at worst. Needless to say, none of them were as terrifying or threatening as they should have been. There's a deeper, related problem lurking here alongside this issue. Even when they introduce villains, they aren't given the time to develop. So even though Darth Vader is around in Kenobi, the villains for the bulk of that show are meant to be the Inquisitors. Now, we know in a very visceral way that Obi-Wan is an incredibly powerful and adept Jedi. We spent the entire prequel trilogy observing his abilities. However, we don't know anything about the Inquisitors except that one of them is very angry and there's an internal power struggle between them. We have no idea about their individual abilities with the Force or lightsabers or any other weapons or any other abilities for that matter. And the writers never show us their abilities or why they might actually be dangerous either. Which brings me to another major problem with the current Star Wars villains: squandering. They've misused Vader big time. The Vader of Rogue One was pure terror. The Vader of Obi-Wan Kenobi was pure, well, Disney Plus streaming content. Obi-Wan should have been either all Vader versus Obi-Wan and no Inquisitors, or Obi-Wan versus Inquisitors with a dose of Vader like Rogue One to show his devastating power. Sprinkling him throughout the show and setting him up in a scene where Vader, one of the most destructive users of the dark side, doesn't kill the man who mangled him is ridiculously out of character for a monster like Darth Vader. As an aside, I must say it just wasn't a good lightsaber fight, but we'll talk more about that soon. You have to wonder, how much are the writers and the creators of these shows even thinking about the role of these powerful, legendary villains? Which brings me to Gorian Shard. The Mandalorian Season 3 earnestly introduced space pirates as a threat to Mando and his friends, and man, that sentence hurts my soul. Gorian Shard, a space pirate captain, was barely around for 2 episodes and has a total of less than 5 minutes of screen time, most of which is him dying. So across 37 episodes of TV, we see a parade of villains including the Order of the Night Wind, the Big Dark Wookiee, the Hutt Twins, Tatooine's Hell's Angels, the Pliskers, Cade the Bounty Hunter, Moff Gideon, Bill Burr, the Inquisitors, and Gorian Shard. Absolutely none of them capture our interest or appear to be any sort of real threat to the protagonists they are set up against. But wait, Thrawn is coming. Even if they introduce Thrawn, it still leaves the challenge of them writing this character. And they have taken 3 separate series to prove to us that they really can't write compelling villains. Well, they can't write anything really. And that brings us to one of the most devastating issues which currently has Disney Star Wars franchise in a total chokehold. It's writing. Modern Disney Star Wars suffers from 2 disastrous approaches to writing. Let's explore both of these. I'm calling this chapter AI writing, but it could just as easily be called product writing or genreification. The main problem here is that people writing for Star Wars don't understand Star Wars, and they also don't love it. Because of these things, they need a rule system to help create Star Wars product, or one of my least favorite words now, Star Wars content. It's why the recent slate of Disney Star Wars looks like Star Wars and technically could be said to have all the elements of Star Wars, but it just isn't Star Wars. This is why it feels like an AI is telling them to include certain things, largely because writers don't understand Star Wars. They treat it like a genre with very explicit rules and the parts of the Star Wars universe that must be included before publishing to Disney+. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Include a droid companion, include a Yoda, include a Wookiee, include a lightsaber slicing off a hand, include a speeder race, and on and on and on. All of this is so self-referential that it feels like a robot writing things based on past scripts, not real humans exploring iconic moments from the Star Wars universe and expanding on them to create new moments that will ring out across the galaxy and turn into legends. So they're running down their checklist of the Star Wars genre demands, adding in the Disney corporate demands and political demands, but they are forgetting the most important parts, the actual story. And once you see what happens when they try to create an actual story on their own, you realize you really wish they hadn't, and you understand why they have the genre content checklist in the first place. On the other side of AI writing, you have something worse than fan fiction writing. This is what happens when you start with the checklists I just elaborated, and then try to do something like invent a new story. So your stories turn out to be over-workshopped content where a bunch of people who can't write get in a room and after integrating checklists from their bosses, build something that doesn't move anyone emotionally because it literally doesn't move either characters or storylines. When I watched Obi-Wan Kenobi, I could literally feel time burning away and the tiny fibers of reality in the universe slowly extinguishing themselves. The same thing happens when I watch the book of Boba Fett and season 3 of The Mandalorian. For each of these shows, nothing really happens to create a sense of momentum for the broader story itself or the characters specifically. There's no momentum because in a workshop discussion, every point has a counterpoint. You're dealing with checklists and compromises. You're not creating great stories and great characters. And if you can't create interesting characters, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to have interesting motivations that audiences can engage with after each episode or film. But you could be saved by a twisty, fast-paced plot. If you can't write compelling plots that keep audiences excited, curious, or generally engaged in some other way, then you're going to have to rely on your characters. If you can do neither of these things, then you've created modern Disney Star Wars. The most annoying thing to me about modern Disney Star Wars is its salivating fetish for cameos. When I see these, instead of excitement, I'm filled with dread. Instead of adding to the story or creating an exciting or enriching moment, cameos have become shorthand for cheap emotional manipulation and writing laziness. Disney Star Wars' cameo fetish has two prongs to it, one for fictional characters and one for real-world celebrities. The cameo fetish for fictional characters ranges from simple to sophisticated, so let's talk about those first. First up, we have the Hutt twins. I remember Jabba the Hutt. He was a fearsome and disgusting crime boss that had Han Solo frozen in carbonite. Now when I see these two show up, I'm just supposed to assume that they're as bad and as gross as he is. So the show is trying to use the remembrance of an original character, create a hack shortcut, and get the audience to transfer their feelings for the original to this copy and paste version. Despicable. Perhaps the greatest and most manipulative cameo is Grogu, or better yet, Baby Yoda. Take a beloved Jedi Master and turn it into a young, innocent version of this legendary character, and you get an immediate best-selling toy. Don't ask about the character's arc or progress through that journey, just enjoy looking into Baby Yoda's deep, big eyes. Ahsoka is a very popular character from the animation, so why specifically was she here on this planet in The Mandalorian Season 2? To get a cheap moment of excitement injected into the show, of course. But there is also a more diabolical reason. She didn't feel so much like a powerful Jedi who just happened to intersect with the Mandalorian as like an obligatory cameo pulled from marketing data, like an early screen test to create projections for how a live-action Ahsoka might perform with fans. Now let's talk about celebrity cameos. They're mostly there for cheap thrills. Jack Black isn't here as Lieutenant Bombardier, he's here as Jack Black. Lizzo isn't here as the Duchess, she's here as the rapper you know that did that annoying song. Christopher Lloyd isn't here as Captain Hellgate, he's here as that charming chap from those cool 80s movies with a twinkle of mischief in his eye. Bill Burr isn't really Mayfield, he's the famous comedian Bill Burr. Isn't it fun to see him in Star Wars? Jude Law won't be whoever his character is in Skeleton Key, he will be Jude Law. Isn't it so cool to see Jude Law in Star Wars? I mean, yes, it might have been if George Lucas was involved. But what's wrong with cameos and a little fan service? The cameo fetish exists because Disney can't create interesting characters in its live-action content. So it has to rely on the hard work of others by bringing back characters none of these people created. Remember how much you love them in the original stories they were involved in? It's weird because in a strange way it's an admission of guilt. We can't make anything interesting, so instead we're going to show you someone else's interesting characters. Something that's bothered me since the sequel trilogy is the lack of a thrilling lightsaber duel. Don't get me wrong, there's been plenty of swinging of the lightsaber, but just like everything else in modern Disney Star Wars, something is missing. Early lightsaber duels were emotionally charged and it felt like the fate of the galaxy was hanging in the balance. They had real consequences. Very often, the good guy loses. In the first lightsaber duel that we ever see, the noble old knight Obi-Wan Kenobi is slain by Darth Vader. Who among us wouldn't want to see a righteous and peaceful elderly knight avenged? Or at least see how Darth Vader fares against a powerful Jedi Knight who is bent on slaying Vader instead of just noble sacrifice. The drama and the emotion has been established for an incredible showdown, and The Empire Strikes Back uses it perfectly. The second lightsaber duel we are ever witness to is a major rematch between good and evil, between the bright and hopeful future and the oppressive power of the present. We all remember that Luke Skywalker's hand is ruthlessly sliced off, and he's forced to choose between becoming evil or jumping to his death. He chooses suicide. If that's a little too strong for you, he chooses to jump and let come what may. Even at this point, as a Star Wars fan, I know that lightsaber duels have serious and often dreadful outcomes. The Star Wars universe has taught me this in a visceral way. Even in the prequels, this remains true. When Obi-Wan duels Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace, we see that Maul is so powerful that he's dueling 2 Jedi at once. Then the film takes it to a whole new level when Maul kills Obi-Wan's beloved master and then glowers at Obi-Wan like, "See what I just did to your master? You're next." It makes you want to leap out of your seat and go avenge Qui-Gon and battle right next to Obi-Wan. There's a real legacy here. What has modern Disney Star Wars done to either preserve or surpass the high stakes and the wild emotional power of lightsaber duels? We need only examine the rematch between Obi-Wan and Vader to see. We know Obi-Wan isn't going to suffer any serious injury. We know Obi-Wan isn't going to die. We've seen the state he's in when they duel all those years later. There's absolutely no stakes here. The legacy has been tarnished. Now, they could have saved this duel with an incredibly stylized battle, but they didn't, which is the other big problem for modern Star Wars lightsaber duels. The fight choreography just isn't there. I'm going to quickly analyze this next to the best lightsaber duel in recent modern Disney Star Wars, Luke's return. Even before I begin this analysis, I have to mention there wasn't even a duel, which is a shame given the obvious dramatic power it affords when 2 incredible characters square off face to face. Just like everyone else, I initially loved seeing a force-wielding, lightsabering Luke return to slaughter a bunch of baddies. I'm going to say this again. In that moment, I loved seeing the return of Luke. But with time, I've come to examine this fight with cool, clear eyes. Luke's lightsaber fight with the robots felt emotionless and bloated. Don't rage quit here just yet. Hear me out. It was nothing compared to the devastating power Vader used in the closing moments of Rogue One. Luke's fight should have been as beautiful as Vader's was destructive. I could feel the desperation each moment the fight continued. It was clear the writers and choreographers were hoping inspiration would kick in and they would find something exciting for Luke to do, but that moment never arrived. The same could be said for the style of the duel between Vader and Obi-Wan in the series Kenobi. It honestly makes me sad to even talk about this fight. It's not a lightsaber duel, it's an overworked shot piece of content. It went on for far too long, it didn't showcase either the rage of Vader or the sophistication of Obi-Wan, and the conclusion of it is just Obi-Wan literally saying goodbye and walking away. No stakes, no style, just content. And just like the absence of truly great lightsaber duels, it's been a long time since I've seen a great battle in space. Look, I don't think epic space battles have to be reserved for theatrical releases. Battlestar Galactica had incredible space battles, all carried out on the small screen. But I can't even remember the last time I saw a fun space battle in Star Wars shows. I mean, this is a fundamental piece of the Star Wars identity, but it doesn't seem to be on the content checklist they keep. So here's hoping they could update that for the next show. And what about the next show? The newly announced slate of Star Wars seems as muddied and directionless as ever. The Skeleton Crew will have Jude Law in it, and that's all anyone's ever going to say about it. The only other thing that will be said is that no one watched it. The Acolyte sadly feels like it's just going to be a political speech run out across 8 episodes and is already advertising itself as something that's not for everyone. The Filoni movie ties together the Mandoverse, as it's being called, and already sounds like a befuddled mess. They know they want to make a movie with all this content, they just aren't quite sure what the story is yet. What could possibly go wrong? The Rey Star Wars movie stinks terribly of a J.J. Abrams-style reboot of The Last Jedi. And what has been revealed so far, Rey will be a self-declared Jedi Master going around the galaxy, rebuilding the Jedi Order. Rebuilding the Jedi Order might be an interesting sliver of a larger movie, but as the main focus, what are the stakes here? Unless the Sith are ruling already and the Jedi are loathed across the galaxy, there's no danger to this. I have no idea why you would even announce this as a plot, let alone announce it as something for people to get excited about. Add in the fact that this will be a Jedi Order created from a Sith descendant and it becomes pretty ridiculous. I think Ahsoka has the potential to be an interesting character study along the lines of the first season of The Mandalorian, but to be honest, it's not going to turn this franchise around. I want to end this on a hopeful note. Star Wars, to me, I'm sure many of you as well, has always been hopeful. Let's talk about the Jedi Order. Can Star Wars' past save its future? This film is the best bet Star Wars has to turn things around. I'm literally keeping my fingers crossed for this movie. I genuinely hope it comes out and undoes everything I've said. I hope it opens a new era of Star Wars in which creativity and storytelling reign supreme once more.